Okay, let's go. Number 1. Sima de los Huesos. The year is 1993. You're a paleoanthropologist at Atapuerca in northern Spain, and you have been crawling for nearly 3 hours. The passage is called Cueva Mayor, the Great Cave. In its tightest sections, the limestone walls press to within 16 inches of your body on either side. You push your equipment bag ahead of you with one hand. The floor is wet limestone, slick in patches. The ceiling grazes your helmet every few yards. You have been told the passage runs approximately 1,600 feet before it terminates. You believe that now. The total darkness outside your headlamp is complete. There is no sound except your own movement. The passage ends. Below you is a vertical shaft, 43 feet straight down. Nothing between you and the bottom but a rope, a headlamp, and the dark. You descend. At the bottom, your headlamp finds the first femur, then a second, then a skull, lying on its side, facing nothing. The shaft is called Sima de los Huesos, the pit of bones. Juan Luis Arsuaga of the Universidad Complutense de Madrid has been working this site since the 1970s. His team's 1993 publication in Nature confirmed what the bones had been quietly establishing for years. The shaft contains 28 nearly complete hominin skeletons, one of the largest concentrations of pre-modern human remains from a single location anywhere on Earth. The species is Homo heidelbergensis, an ancestor shared by both Neanderthals and anatomically modern Homo sapiens, predating both. Not a primitive brute. Not a transitional sketch. An organized, socially complex hominin, one whose lineage would eventually diverge into the two most studied branches of the genus Homo, both of whom would outlast it. These individuals lived 430,000 years ago. That is 200,000 years before the first Neanderthal. It is approximately 395,000 years before the next confirmed evidence of intentional burial anywhere on Earth. The bones are not fragmentary. They are not scattered. They are concentrated at the base of a 43-foot vertical shaft at the end of a passage that nothing enters by accident. Here's where it gets strange. There are no carnivore marks on the bones consistent with predator activity. No evidence of habitation, no hearths, no food refuse, no flint debitage from tool manufacture. No flood deposits that would explain mass transport. No roof collapse, no geological event. Arsuaga's team has published one conclusion consistent with all of this. The bodies were brought here and deposited intentionally. Deliberate mortuary behavior at 430,000 years old. That conclusion currently stands without a competing explanation supported by physical evidence. The next confirmed evidence of intentional burial anywhere on Earth comes roughly 400,000 years later. Among the 28 individuals, men, women, and children, across multiple age ranges, excavators recovered exactly one non-skeletal object, a handaxe. It is made of red quartzite, a material that does not occur naturally in the Cueva Mayor cave system. Someone carried it in from elsewhere. The tool is bifacially worked, symmetrical in form, and shows no use where consistent with butchering or woodworking. It does not look like a working tool. Arsuaga's team named it Excalibur. It was found not in the approach passage, not at the lip of the shaft, but among the bones, at the base of the pit, in direct association with the dead. One tool, one color, one shaft. Whether Excalibur was placed there deliberately, whether it constitutes an offering, a marker, an object left with the dead for reasons we have no framework to name, is a question the physical evidence cannot resolve. What the evidence can confirm is that it was there, that it was the only tool, and that it was red. The site is accessible only through the Cueva Mayor passage, which requires removing all external equipment and crawling the full 1,600-foot length in sections tight enough that a standard backpack cannot be worn. The final approach ends at the shaft, which requires technical rope work and trained personnel to descend safely. Access is controlled by the Junta de Castilla y León, the regional government of Castile and León, in coordination with Arsuaga's research team at the Universidad Complutense. Approximately 10 to 15 researchers are permitted access per year. The general public cannot enter. The shaft's lower levels, below the current excavation floor, are still unworked. Arsuaga's team has documented that bone-bearing deposits continue below the current excavation level. What is in those layers is not known. Was Excalibur carried down the shaft by the same group that deposited the bodies, or did it arrive separately, at a different time? Who decided that the dead needed to go down a 43-foot shaft at the end of a 1,600-foot crawl in the dark? Were there more than 28 individuals? Are there more below the current excavation floor, in levels no team has yet reached? What does it mean that the oldest confirmed mortuary behavior on Earth is located in a space designed by its physical geometry to receive things permanently, a place you can deposit something and cannot easily retrieve? And who, 430,000 years ago, decided that this shaft, in this cave, in this limestone hillside in northern Spain, was the right place to carry the dead? 430,000 years ago, something drove the Atapuerca hominins to carry their dead to a place designed, by its geometry, to receive things and not give them back, a shaft at the end of a 1,600-foot crawl, built to keep what was deposited there from outside eyes. In Egypt, that same instinct achieved its most deliberate architectural expression, a complex that 4 ancient writers confirmed as the largest building in the world, with an underground half that its own priests sealed from view. Number 2. Labyrinth of Hawara. The year is 2008. You're a researcher standing in a flat agricultural field outside Hawara, in the Fayum region of Egypt, and the ground-penetrating radar unit you're pulling is returning signals that should not be there. The field is ordinary, silt, irrigation channels, crops in rows. Nothing above ground suggests that anything other than soil is below your feet. But the radar is reading geometry, rectangular, repeating, organized. Not the noise of stratified sediment, not a single buried wall or isolated structural anomaly. Consistent grid-patterned returns beginning approximately 8 feet below the surface and extending downward across the survey transect. You push the unit forward. The signal does not stop. Louis de Cordier, an independent Belgian researcher working with a Belgian survey team, published these results in 2008. The ground-penetrating radar survey at Hawara returned signatures consistent with a large man-made complex, thousands of chambers arranged in a repeating grid pattern at depths between 8 and 12 feet below the current agricultural surface. The site is located adjacent to the pyramid of Amenemhat III, 12th dynasty pharaoh of Egypt, who reigned around 1800 BC. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities did not authorize excavation in response to these findings. De Cordier's results have been disputed. They have not been disproven. Here's where it gets strange. The structure de Cordier's radar may have found is not speculative. It is one of the most thoroughly documented buildings the ancient world produced, confirmed by 4 independent written sources across nearly 500 years, each of whom visited the site and described what they saw. Herodotus traveled to Egypt around 450 BC and described a structure at Hawara he called the Labyrinth. His account is specific: 3,000 rooms, 1,500 above ground, and 1,500 below. He toured the above-ground portion. He was refused entry to the underground half. Egyptian priests told him directly that the subterranean section contained the tombs of the crocodile gods and of the pharaohs who had built the structure. Herodotus had already seen the pyramids at Giza. He described this structure as more astonishing than all of them combined. Strabo visited around 25 BC and independently confirmed a structure of comparable scale at the same location, noting that the complex's principal halls opened into one another in a long, organized sequence. Diodorus Siculus documented it separately. Pliny the Elder described it in Natural History, calculated the total covered floor space, and concluded it represented the largest roofed building complex for which he had evidence anywhere in the known world. 4 writers, 4 independent accounts, nearly 500 years of documentation. The above-ground portion no longer exists. The Romans quarried it systematically, stripping the superstructure and redistributing the material as construction stone. The demolition was thorough enough that the building Herodotus walked through has been reduced to a rubble field at the base of Amenemhat III's pyramid. But the underground half, the 1,500 rooms Herodotus was refused entry to, the tombs of the crocodile gods and the pharaohs, was built below the ground line the Romans were working. The water table in the Fayum region has risen substantially since antiquity, and the site is now beneath active farmland and waterlogged alluvial soil. If any of the underground structure survived Roman demolition of the above-ground portion, It would be where Decordier's radar placed the readings, several feet below a field that no excavation team has cut into. No permit has been issued. No trench has been dug. The field is still a field. The oldest documented restriction on archaeological access in the historical record is a sentence in Herodotus noting, without editorial comment, that the priests of the labyrinth in 450 BC would not allow him to see the underground chambers. He did not press the point. He recorded the refusal and continued, "The priests who enforced that prohibition are gone. The institution they served is gone. The above-ground structure they presided over is gone. The underground chambers they would not show Herodotus are still there, according to the best available geophysical evidence, 8 to 12 feet below a field in the Fayum. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities has not authorized a single excavation trench to determine whether Decordier's reading is correct. The priest's prohibition, first documented in 450 BC, has held for 2,500 years. What is in the underground chambers of the labyrinth of Hawara, the 1,500 rooms Herodotus was refused entry to, the tombs the priests were protecting when they turned away a Greek historian in 450 BC? If the above-ground structure that 4 ancient writers independently confirmed as the largest building complex in the ancient world was demolished by Rome, and the subterranean section was sealed below a rising water table, what condition are those chambers in now? Intact, collapsed, flooded, or something the ancient sources never anticipated? When Decordier's radar returned readings consistent with thousands of organized chambers at a site 4 ancient writers confirmed as real, why has no institution issued a permit to cut a single trench and test the reading against the ground? And if the Egyptian priests refused Herodotus entry to those underground chambers in 450 BC because they contained the tombs of gods and kings, who decided, 2,500 years later, that the refusal still stands? The labyrinth's underground half remains beneath Egyptian farmland, sealed not by a locked door, but by soil, a raised water table, and the absence of a permit. In the Altai Mountains of Siberia, a cave that looked unremarkable from the outside was holding a different kind of sealed record. Not architecture, not tombs, but a fragment of bone from a species that had no name. Number 3. Denisova Cave. The year is 2010. You're a paleogeneticist at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. On your bench is a fragment of bone, a distal phalanx, the terminal tip of a little finger. It arrived from Siberia months ago. It was excavated from the east chamber of a limestone cave in the Altai Mountains by Mikhail Shunkov of the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography in Novosibirsk in 2008. The bone is between 76,000 and 82,000 years old. It belonged to a child, a girl, based on the mitochondrial sequence you have been running. The fragment is small enough to rest on a fingertip. You have sequenced its mitochondrial DNA. You run the sequence against the database. It does not match Homo sapiens. It does not match Neanderthal. It matches nothing in the database. Svante Pabo's team at the Max Planck Institute published the results in Nature in March 2010. The hominin was named Denisovan, after the cave. The entire physical evidence for a previously unknown species of human consisted, at the time of publication, of 1 fingertip bone and 2 molars, all recovered from the same cave. The cave is unremarkable from the outside, a 3-chambered limestone cavern in the Anhui River Valley, its entrances open to the valley floor, used for millennia as a seasonal shelter by modern humans, Neanderthals, and evidently at least one additional group no one had named. No cliff to descend, no narrow crawl, just a cave. The data coming out of it rewrote the human family tree. The cave has 3 distinct chambers. The main chamber has been the most extensively excavated, with archaeological strata spanning more than 300,000 years of intermittent occupation. The south chamber is partially worked. The east chamber, the deepest, the smallest, the most significant, is where the finger bone and the molars were found. Its deeper layers remain untouched. The east chamber is still closed to full excavation. The distinction matters. The cave's most productive section and its least investigated section are the same place. Here's where it gets strange. Environmental DNA extracted from the cave sediment, not from bones, but from the soil itself, has revealed Denisovan and Neanderthal genetic material in layers where no fossil remains have survived. The cave floor holds a molecular record that outlasts physical bone and registers the presence of hominins who left nothing else behind. The sediment shows Denisovans and Neanderthals present in occupation periods when their bones have not survived. The physical fossil count undercounts, by an unknown margin, the number of individuals who actually used this cave. The soil is more informative than the skeletons. In 2018, Payabo's team published analysis of a bone fragment designated Denisova 11. Mother Neanderthal, father Denisovan, one child, one bone. The two lineages had diverged approximately 390,000 years ago and traveled separate evolutionary trajectories before meeting in this cave. The child they produced is the only confirmed first-generation hybrid of two distinct hominin species ever recovered from any site anywhere on Earth. It is not an inference. It is a physical fragment of bone from this cave floor, analyzed at a bench in Leipzig. Payabo's body of work on Denisovan and Neanderthal ancient DNA, built substantially on material from this site, earned him the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022. Denisova Cave is the only known site confirmed to have been occupied by three separate hominin species, Denisovans, Neanderthals, and Homo sapiens, whose material appears in the upper layers. The timeline of overlapping occupation, which species were present simultaneously, whether the interbreeding documented by Denisova 11 was an isolated event or part of a longer pattern, has not been resolved. The East Chamber, which produced the most significant finds, has not been fully excavated. The question of what its deeper layers contain is not speculative, it is simply unanswered, and the sediment that might answer it is still there. The cave is an active excavation site managed by the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography, Siberian Branch, Russian Academy of Sciences. Access requires institutional authorization from the Novosibirsk Directorate. The East Chamber is not open to independent researchers. The international partnership between the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and the Russian team, the collaboration that produced the Nobel Prize-winning findings, has been disrupted by geopolitical conditions since 2022. No public timeline exists for resuming joint research under any arrangement. What is in the unexcavated layers of the East Chamber? If the cave sediment holds genetic records in horizons where no bones have survived, what does the soil in the deepest untouched sections contain? Records of hominins who left no physical trace at all. If three hominin species occupied this cave over 300,000 years, and Denisovans and Neanderthals produced at least one child here, was that event an exception, or a pattern the current excavation has only partially exposed? If access to answering these questions depends on a research partnership that political conditions have placed on hold, who decides what gets sequenced next, and when? And what is the East Chamber still holding, not because the cave is sealed, not because the passage is too narrow, but because no authorized team has yet finished going in? Denisova Cave held its secrets passively, in bone and soil, sealed not by human design but by geological time, inaccessible now not because the passage is too narrow but because the political conditions are. In Campania, the secret was the opposite of passive, a tunnel carved specifically to engineer what happened to the human mind inside it, sealed by modern authorities, after the only team that went in came back with an account no one has been permitted to check. Number 4. Oracle Tunnel of Baiae. The year is 1962. You're a British researcher named Robert Paget, and you've just crawled through a passage that gets hotter with every foot you descend. You are inside a hillside above the ancient resort town of Baiae, modern Baia, on the northern edge of the Bay of Naples. The hillside is volcanic tuff, the compressed ash of the Campi Flegrei field underlying this stretch of Campanian coast. What surrounds you is not a natural formation. The walls are cut, the angles are deliberate. The passage descends at a controlled, consistent gradient into the hill. You have advanced approximately 400 feet from the entrance. The air temperature has been rising for the last 100 feet. The passage narrows to crawl width. You go to your hands and knees. The temperature reads 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat is radiating from every surface, floor, ceiling, walls, simultaneously. You continue. The passage opens. Ahead of you, audible before you can see it, is the sound of running water. Robert Paget and Keith Jones, both independent British researchers, entered this tunnel in 1962 while investigating local traditions at Baye, pointing to an ancient entrance to the underworld. The tunnel is carved entirely into volcanic tuff, not a natural cave but a deliberate man-made construction, descending approximately 400 feet into the hillside at a calculated angle. At the deepest accessible point, the passage ends at an underground stream. Paget documented the superheated passage section, measured temperatures at 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and recovered ancient ceramic fragments from an inner chamber on the far side of the constricted section. He spent the following decades developing the implications of what the tunnel's architecture suggested. Here's where it gets strange. Baye was built over a Greek settlement, and the volcanic coastline surrounding it, the Phlegrean fields, the sulfurous vents, the thermally active ground, is the geography associated by ancient commentators with the classical world's two most foundational descents into the realm of the dead. Virgil, writing around 19 BC, placed the entrance to the underworld at Cumae, a few miles from Baye, in the Aeneid. Homer's account of Odysseus visiting the dead was associated by ancient geographers with this same volcanic coast. Paget's interpretation, published in The Oracle of the Dead in 1997, was that the tunnel at Baye was the physical engineering behind both descriptions. A deliberately constructed system replicating the classical underworld as a functioning ritual installation. The passage sequence was specific: a long, dark, descending approach, a superheated, constricted section that forced the person entering it to crawl at 120 degrees, heat so intense it became the primary physical experience, a cooler chamber opening beyond the constriction. An underground stream at the terminus, which Paget identified as a deliberate hydrothermal engineering feature reproducing the river Styx. The ceramic fragments in the inner sanctuary were consistent with ritual deposition. The architecture, in Paget's reading, was not incidental to a ritual encounter with the dead. It was the mechanism of one. John Shepherd of the University of Leicester subsequently engaged with Paget's account and the physical evidence he documented. No institutional archaeological team has conducted a full, independent investigation inside the tunnel since Paget's original entry. Paget's interpretation remains contested. It has not been refuted by physical evidence from inside the tunnel, because no research team has gone back in under conditions permitting systematic documentation. Italian authorities sealed the entrance to the tunnel following Paget's investigation. Access now falls under the Italian Ministry of Culture, which administers the Baia Archaeological Park where the tunnel is located. No research or excavation permit has been granted to any team since the entrance was sealed. The 120-degree passage creates conditions that require thermal protection not available to Paget's 1962 entry. No modern safety assessment has been submitted to the ministry as part of an access application. The underground stream at the terminus has not been examined by any team since 1962. The entrance remains sealed. The only physical account of the tunnel's interior is Paget's. It describes a man-made system built specifically to produce the conditions of approaching the dead: darkness, constriction, searing heat, and arrival at a running underground river. A cult installation, not representing the underworld, but functionally replicating it, designed to alter what the person descending it experienced at every level: physical, sensory, cognitive. That interpretation has been in the literature since 1997. The site it describes has been sealed since the 1960s. One team went in, no team has gone back. Who built the Oracle Tunnel at Baiae? Greek settlers who arrived on this volcanic coast in the 8th century BC, or a tradition that predates them, working from knowledge of the Phlegrean field's hydrothermal behavior that no other surviving source documents? If the underground stream was an engineered feature replicating the river Styx, what did the builders understand about the volcanic geology beneath the Phlegrean fields, and what other installations used that same knowledge? What is in the inner sanctuary beyond the 120-degree passage that Paget could not safely document in full? Why has the Italian Ministry of Culture not authorized re-entry to the only site that is a physical candidate for the literal entrance to the underworld described in two of the foundational texts of Western civilization? And if the conditions inside the tunnel were severe enough to seal it after one entry, what has 60 years of volcanic heat done to what Paget left behind? The Oracle Tunnel was sealed after one team came out with findings. No subsequent team has been permitted to check against the physical evidence. In a limestone cave above the Arpa River in the Armenian highlands, no authority sealed anything. The cave preserved 6,000 years of evidence on its own, waiting for excavators with the methods to read what it held. Number 5. Areni, one cave. The year is 2010. You're a bioarchaeologist working in a cave above the Arpa River Gorge in the Armenian highlands, not far from the Iranian border. The cave sits in a limestone cliff face. The air inside is cool and remarkably dry, the kind of stable, low-humidity environment that slows organic decomposition to a near standstill. You have been working through a deposit layer in the outer chamber for several hours, cataloging what the sediment gives up in sequence. The outer chamber is the only section of this cave system that has been excavated. Beyond a certain point, the passage is narrow and the ceiling drops, and the structural assessment is still not complete. You are working in what has been deemed the accessible portion. You have not yet reached the limit of what the accessible portion contains. On the floor, arranged with no visible randomness, you find a child's skull. Near the skull, a ceramic vessel. The vessel is stained dark along the interior walls. You take a sample. The stain is grape residue, fermented. The cave is Areni, 1, in the Vayats-Dzor province of southern Armenia, above the Arpa River. Systematic excavation began in 2007 under Boris Gasparian of the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography, National Academy of Sciences of Armenia in Yerevan, in collaboration with Gregory Oreshian of the UCLA Kotzen Institute of Archaeology. The cave system is not large from the outside. What it has produced across successive excavation seasons in its outer chambers has no parallel at any other site. The oldest winery on Earth. A complete production installation, a grape pressing platform, fermentation vats, storage jars, and a ceramic cup, dated to approximately 6,100 years old, published in 2011 in the Journal of Archaeological Science. Older than the next confirmed winery by more than 1,000 years. The oldest leather shoe on Earth. A single laced shoe, recovered in 2008, constructed from one piece of leather, stuffed with grass, dated 5,500 years old. Published 2010 in PLOS 1. The only preserved ancient human brain tissue currently known to exist on Earth. Excavators recovered approximately 40 skulls across the deposit layers, some showing evidence of deliberate placement. One of those skulls contained preserved brain tissue approximately 6,000 years old. Published by Lilit Kachatrian of the Institute of Molecular Biology, National Academy of Sciences of Armenia, in 2020. No other site on Earth has produced ancient human brain tissue in a preserved state. This is the only example. Here's where it gets strange. The brain survived because 3 preservation conditions converged in a way that rarely occurs together. The cave's cool, stable interior slowed microbial activity below the threshold for rapid decomposition. The brain shrank quickly after death, separating from the inner skull surface, a physical separation that reduces the sustained contact that drives decay. And tannins leaching from grape-pressing residue into the surrounding sediment created a mild chemical preservation environment in the exact deposit layer where the skull was found. The winery and the skull were in spatial proximity. The compound processing grapes 6,000 years ago and the brain tissue that survived to 2020 were in the same chamber. The preservation was not accidental in the sense that the conditions that made it possible were created by human activity in the same space. Someone was pressing grapes. Someone was depositing a skull. These were happening in the same place at approximately the same time. Multiple juvenile skulls recovered across the deposit layers show perimortem trauma, damage consistent with the time of death, not with post-depositional disturbance. Their positions place them in association with the winery installation and the ceramic vessels, not discarded randomly, but arranged in patterns suggesting deliberate placement. Gasparian's team has described these as possible ceremonial deposition. No definitive interpretation has been published. The spatial relationship between fermentation infrastructure and the remains of children recurs across multiple points in the deposit. The cave system extends beyond what has been excavated. The inner sections of Areni 1 are still closed. Gasparian's team is working through the outer chambers in active excavation seasons. The inner passages have been assessed as structurally unstable, and are pending further evaluation before any team enters. The cave is not fully mapped. What the intersections contain has not been determined. Areni 1 is an active excavation site. The outer chambers are accessible to the research team and a limited number of invited collaborating scholars. No public access is permitted. The intersections are closed to all personnel until structural assessment is complete. Excavation of the outer chambers is ongoing. Why is the oldest winery in the world in the same cave as the skulls of children with perimortem trauma? How does brain tissue survive 6,000 years? And would this particular brain have survived if the tannins from the wine press had not been leaching into the sediment beside it? What is in the intersections that Gasparian's team has not yet entered? If the outer chambers alone have produced 3 world firsts and evidence of child sacrifice, what is the inner cave still holding? And what exactly was happening in Areni? 1. What ritual, what understanding of death and fermentation, and the dark interior of a limestone cliff that we do not yet have the physical evidence to name? Areni 1 shows us ritual behavior 6,000 years old. The cave in Malaga shows us something 65,000 years old, and it doesn't belong to us at all. Number 6. Cueva de Ardales. The year is 2018. You're a geochronologist working in a cave that was sealed by an earthquake roughly 13,000 years ago and rediscovered in 1821 when a local road-widening blast cracked open its entrance. The cave is in the limestone hills above the Ardales Reservoir, an hour inland from Malaga. The walls carry paintings, horses, deer, bison, and geometric signs in multiple layers. You have been sampling calcite crust that has grown over sections of the painted surface, using uranium-thorium isotope ratios to establish when each application was made. You take a sample from directly over a section of red pigment, not a recognizable figure, just pigment applied to the surface of a natural stalagmite formation deep in the cave interior. You send the sample to the lab. The result: 65,000 years old, plus or minus 4,000. João Zilhão, of the Catalan Institution for Research and Advanced Studies at the University of Barcelona, and Dirk Hoffman, of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, published these results in Science in February 2018. Uranium-thorium dating of calcite crust establishes a minimum age for the underlying pigment. The calcite cannot have formed before the paint beneath it dried. If the calcite is 65,000 years old, the paint is at least 65,000 years old. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens did not arrive in Western Europe until approximately 40,000 to 45,000 years ago. The gap between the age of that red pigment and the earliest confirmed presence of our species on this continent is 20,000 to 25,000 years. There was only one hominin in southern Spain 65,000 years ago. That hominin was not us. Here's where it gets strange. The cave's paintings span approximately 25,000 years of active use. The earliest applications, dated to 65,000 years ago, belong to Neanderthals, the only hominin present in Iberia during that period. Homo sapiens arrived later and continued using the cave, adding figures over, beside, and in the same chambers as the older marks. 2 separate species, separated by at least 25,000 years, use this specific interior as a site of symbolic activity. Whether Homo sapiens, returning to Ardales after millennia of abandonment, recognize the older marks as art made by a different kind of being is a question the physical evidence cannot address. Whether it mattered to them is equally inaccessible. The 2018 paper did not add a data point to an existing picture. It overturned a foundational assumption. The production of abstract symbolic marks, pigment applied with apparent intentionality to a non-functional surface, had been understood as a behavior exclusive to anatomically modern Homo sapiens, a signature of our cognitive lineage, a threshold our species crossed and others did not. Zilhão and Hoffman demonstrated that Neanderthals were doing it 25,000 years before our species reached the continent. Neanderthals had symbolic behavior. They returned to this cave across multiple generations, applying, repeating, and accumulating marks on its walls over a span of time longer than all of recorded human civilization. The marks that opened this question were not figures of animals. Abstract, intentional, 65,000 years old. Multiple passages in Cueva de Ardales are inaccessible for most of the year. The cave sits in the valley of the Ardales Reservoir and its lateral tunnels flood seasonally from October through April. Several of these passages have never been entered at any point by any research team. Whether they contain pigment, and how old that pigment might be, cannot be determined without access that the seasonal water still prevents. If the accessible sections contain Neanderthal art at 65,000 years, the sealed passages may hold material that is older still. There is no way to determine this without entering them. The cave is managed by the Ayuntamiento de Ardales, the Ardales Municipal Authority. Limited guided public access operates in the outer sections during the dry season. Research access to the deeper passages requires authorization from the Junta de Andalucía. The flooded lateral tunnels cannot be entered from October through April and are not part of any current active research program. Several lateral passages have never been entered by any team under any conditions. What is in the flooded passages? If Neanderthals were making symbolic marks 65,000 years ago, selecting specific cave surfaces, returning to this specific interior across multiple generations, applying pigment with evident intention, what else were they doing that has not survived, or has not yet been found? When Homo sapiens arrived in this cave and found marks already on the walls, made by a hominin absent for thousands of years, did they recognize them as art? Did they see them as territory, as sign, as something without a name in any language yet spoken? Why did they return to this cave specifically, out of every limestone interior in southern Iberia, to add their own marks alongside marks they could not have made? And what does it mean that the most significant evidence for Neanderthal symbolic thought is still sealed inside a cave that floods every winter, held back, for 6 months of every year, by the water? Cueva de Ardales shows art made across 2 species over 25,000 years. In Asturias, a single cave held 20,000 years of painting by one species, and its most significant chamber has never been entered since the night it was found. Number 7. Tito Bustillo Cave. The year is 1968. You're a caver named Celestino Fernandez Bustillo, and you are pushing through a narrow, unexplored passage in the limestone hills above the Sella River in Asturias, on Spain's northern Atlantic coast. The passage has never been entered. You squeeze through a tight section, emerge into a wider space, and your headlamp finds the far wall. It is covered with horses. Painted horses, dozens of them, in red and black and yellow ochre, layered over each other, generation on top of generation. You don't know yet that the oldest of these figures are at least 22,000 years old. You don't know that the most recent were made approximately 14,000 years ago. You don't know that this cave was in continuous use as a site of symbolic activity for 8,000 years. What you know is that your headlamp is moving across a wall of animals that no living person has ever seen. Celestino Bustillo died in an accident shortly after this discovery. The cave carries his name. Systematic excavation and formal study of Tito Bustillo began in 1970. Rodrigo de Balbín Behrman of the University of Alcalá led subsequent research on the site's art in the decades that followed. The cave holds more than 150 individual animal figures spanning the Gravetian through Magdalenian periods, from approximately 22,000 to 14,000 years before present. Horses are the dominant subject, but bison, deer, reindeer, ibex, and abstract geometric signs are also present across the cave's panels. In multiple locations, figures from one period are painted directly over figures from a previous period. Magdalenian artists laid their marks on top of Gravetian work, applying new figures to surfaces where older figures already existed. The older work was ancient by the time the later artists arrived, ancient enough that they may have had no framework for knowing who made the original marks, or when, or with what intent. Whether the superimposition represents deliberate tribute, ritual accumulation, territorial marking, or something without a modern equivalent, the physical evidence does not resolve. The cave was opened to limited public access in the 1970s. By 1991, visitor-related deterioration had become measurable. Human breath and body heat introduce moisture and elevated CO2 into enclosed cave environments, accelerating biological growth and surface degradation on painted limestone, the same process that destroyed significant portions of the art at Altamira Cave, roughly 200 miles to the east, after it was opened to mass tourism. Following that precedent, the management committee for Tito Bustillo restricted access sharply in 1991. Visitor numbers were capped, and all research entry was placed under permit authorization from the Principado de Asturias, the regional government of Asturias. The cave has operated under those restrictions for more than 30 years. Here's where it gets strange. During the initial survey work of the early 1970s, researchers identified a separate interior section they designated the sanctuary. It contains what survey assessments described as the densest concentration of painted figures in the entire system: more figures, more superimposition, more accumulated symbolic activity than any other part of the cave. The sanctuary was photographed with long lens equipment through a gap in the approach passage. It has not been entered. The approach corridor is structurally unstable, the surrounding rock is fractured, and sustained excavation traffic through that passage would risk damaging both the approach itself and the floor deposit in the sanctuary. Following the Altamira lesson, the decision was made to document from the opening and not proceed. The sanctuary has been seen through a gap once. It is still unenterable. More than 50 years have passed. The sanctuary exists. It is mapped. It is a known, identified, physically present chamber, a short distance from a passage where researchers have stood and photographed it. The reason no team has entered it is not that an institution has formally prohibited entry, and not that the necessary access technology does not exist. It is that the risk of damage to what is inside has, for 5 decades, been judged too high to accept. The most significant interior section of one of Europe's major Paleolithic art sites is sealed by that single ongoing decision. Several other sections of Tito Bustillo are affected by seasonal water infiltration, passages where drainage compromises both structural stability and the integrity of any floor sediment those passages contain. These sections have not been formally surveyed. The full extent of the cave system has not been completely mapped. The cave is open to a strictly limited number of visitors per day during summer months. Research access to the deeper sections requires advance authorization from the Principado de Asturias. The sanctuary has not been entered since the mid-1970s survey work. The approach passage remains classified as structurally unstable. What is in the sanctuary? If the outer sections of Tito Bustillo produced 150 animal figures and evidence of 8,000 years of continuous use, what does the cave's densest concentration of painted figures look like at close range, and what condition will it be in when the decision to enter is finally made? Did the Magdalenian artists who painted over Grevetian work know what they were covering, or did the older marks appear to them as something already ancient and anonymous, left by people too remote to name? Why has the most significant chamber in a major European Paleolithic site remained physically unentered for more than half a century, when it is a few meters from a passage researchers have stood in? And what is in the water-damaged sections that no research team has formally documented? Tito Bustillo accumulated art over 20,000 years in a cave no one has fully entered. Sterkfontein accumulated bones over 3.67 million years in a cave no one has fully excavated, and it is still going. Number 8. Sterkfontein Caves. The year is 1994. You're a paleoanthropologist at Sterkfontein, and for the past 3 years you have been working a single block of limestone breccia. The block is roughly the size of a large suitcase. X-ray analysis has already confirmed what is inside. A nearly complete hominin skeleton, limbs articulated, skull intact. Preservation, unlike anything previously recovered from this site. The breccia is the problem. It is in places harder than the bone it encases. The wrong tool pressure, too much force, wrong angle, wrong speed, destroys what you are trying to expose. You are working with dental picks, small pneumatic chisels, and brushes. Progress is measured in millimeters per session. It will take you 20 more years to finish. When Ron Clark of the University of the Witwatersrand completed the extraction of the skeleton designated State W 573 in 2018, the specimen known as Little Foot, it had been in active preparation for over 2 decades. It is the most complete Australopithecus africanus skeleton ever recovered, 3.67 million years old, with more than 90% of skeletal elements present and in anatomical position. Published in a series of papers from 2018 to 2022. 20 years, 1 skeleton. That is not a reflection of inadequate resources or insufficient commitment. That is what this cave requires. At 3.67 million years old, Littlefoot predates Lucy, the Australopithecus afarensis skeleton from Hadar, Ethiopia, dated to 3.2 million years ago, making it the oldest and most complete Australopithecus specimen recovered from any site on Earth. Sterkfontein's documented history begins earlier. Robert Broom, of the Transvaal Museum in Pretoria, recovered the skull of Australopithecus africanus, known as Missus Ples, specimen STS5, in 1947, in collaboration with John T. Robinson, Missus Ples is still one of the most recognized early hominin crania in the world. The site has produced more than 500 individual Australopithecus specimens since systematic excavation began in the 1930s, more than any other location on Earth. The cave system forms part of the UNESCO World Heritage, Cradle of Humankind designation, covering approximately 47,000 hectares of the Gauteng fossil fields. No comparable area on Earth has produced a comparable density of early hominin material. Here's where it gets strange. The Sterkfontein cave system has 6 distinct chambers. The public accessible sections cover the historically excavated areas near the main entrance. The deeper chambers are subject to active research excavation under institutional permit, but what makes this cave extraordinary also makes it resistant to excavation at every stage. The breccia matrix encasing the fossils is in some places harder than the bone itself, a geological reversal that turns precision extraction into an act of sustained endurance rather than speed. Sections of the system flood seasonally from the Bluebank Spruit River drainage, rendering those areas inaccessible for months at a time and depositing sediment that must be removed before any fossil work can resume. Passages exist that are structurally too fragile or physically too constricted for sustained equipment work. The fossil-bearing breccia in the unexcavated sections is confirmed to be present. Survey data has established this, but confirmed presence and accessible deposit are not the same thing. The cave is not empty beyond the excavated sections. It simply has not been fully entered on any pace its geology permits. The extraction of Littlefoot demonstrated what this environment demands at its most concentrated. 1 specimen, 1 trained team, 2 decades of continuous precision work. The breccia surrounding Littlefoot has still not been completely cleared. Adjacent areas of the same deposit continue to produce new fossil material as the excavation advances outward from the original extraction site. The pace of discovery at Sterkfontein is not set by shortage of interest or commitment. It is set by a cave that gives up its contents on geological time, not human time, and that imposes its conditions on every team that enters it. Sterkfontein is open daily under the Maropeng and Sterkfontein Caves management structure. Research access to the active excavation sections requires University of the Witwatersrand institutional authorization and a permit from the South African Heritage Resources Agency. The cave sections beyond the tourist chambers are not accessible to any independent visitor. The deeper passages and flood-prone sections remain incompletely excavated, with no public timeline established for completion. How many more complete skeletons are embedded in the breccia of the unexcavated chambers? If 1 specimen required 20 years of precision work, and the fossil-bearing breccia extends through multiple chambers that have not been fully entered, how many decades of excavation remain before Sterkfontein's full inventory is approached? The site has already produced more Australopithecus material than all other hominin sites on Earth combined, more than 500 individuals, across 90 years of work, and the majority of the cave system's fossil-bearing deposits remain unworked. If the cave floods every season and seals sections of itself until the water drops, what is sitting in those flooded passages, intact, undisturbed, encased in breccia harder than bone, waiting for a team that the water has not yet allowed in? Rising Star Cave, less than a mile away, asks something harder, not what is in the rock. What it means when a new species of human deposits its dead in a chamber reachable only by people small enough to fit through a gap the width of a human shoulder. Number 9. Rising Star Cave. The year is 2013. You're one of 6 cavers selected by Lee Berger of the University of the Witwatersrand after he posted an unusual job listing. Experienced spelunkers, small frame, trained in vertical rope work, willing to enter an unmapped passage whose physical dimensions were listed in the requirements rather than the destination. The passage had already been entered once, by 2 amateur cavers, Stephen Tucker and Rick Hunter, who found what was at the bottom. You are now roughly 230 feet underground. To reach where you are, you spent the better part of an hour crawling on your belly through a passage called Superman's Crawl. arms extended forward, no room to turn your head, approximately 430 feet of that. Then you crossed the dragon's back, a ridge of fractured dolomite at a 45-degree incline with edges sharp enough to cut gear. Then you reached the chute. The chute is 7 inches wide at its narrowest point. It descends 39 feet straight down. At the bottom, in a chamber no scientific team had previously entered, you find bones. Not one individual's bones. Hundreds of elements, teeth, femora, skull fragments, small hand bones, concentrated and layered, present in numbers that indicate not a single event but many. Lee Berger and Paul Dirks of James Cook University led the formal Rising Star expedition. The fossil material was described in eLife in 2015 as a new species, Homo naledi, named for the Sesotho word for star, after the cave. The naledi chamber has since yielded more than 1,550 fossil specimens representing at least 15 individuals, infants, juveniles, adults, elderly members, spanning multiple life stages and indicating repeated depositional events over time, not a single catastrophic incident. Dating, published in 2017, placed the assemblage at between 236,000 and 335,000 years old, considerably younger than initial estimates, which made the mortuary question more acute rather than less. Homo naledi's anatomy is a mosaic. Brain volume, approximately 465 to 560 cubic centimeters. A modern human averages roughly 1,400 cubic centimeters. A chimpanzee averages roughly 400. Homo naledi falls slightly above the chimpanzee range. Its legs were long and suited for walking upright. Its fingers were curved, the curvature of primates that still spend significant time in trees. It walked upright. It climbed. It had a brain roughly the size of an orange. This combination fits no established position in the existing hominin family tree. Here's where it gets strange. The naledi chamber contains no evidence of any other species, no predator remains, no leopard, no hyena, no carnivore that would indicate a kill site or a den. No sediment signature consistent with water flow sufficient to transport bodies from another location. No evidence of roof collapse or geological event that could account for the concentration of remains. The only explanation consistent with all the physical evidence published and subjected to peer review, Homo naledi repeatedly brought its dead to this chamber and left them there. Deliberate mortuary behavior. Not by Homo sapiens. Not by a hominin with a large brain. By a species with a brain approximately 1/3 the volume of ours, in a chamber accessible only through a 39-foot vertical descent in total darkness. Either mortuary behavior does not require large brain volume, which overturns one of paleoanthropology's foundational assumptions about what separates cognitively complex hominins from those that are not. Or Homo naledi's cognitive capacity was not reflected by its brain volume, which overturns a different foundational assumption. Both remain unresolved. Neither has been dismissed. Both have been published, debated, and left open in the peer-reviewed record. In 2017, a second fossil chamber was identified in a separate section of the cave system, the Naledi chamber, containing an additional partial skeleton designated Neo and further fossil elements, confirming that body deposition was not confined to Naledi. The cave system has not been fully mapped. Passages exist beyond both known chambers that no team has entered and surveyed. The system is still producing. The system is still largely unknown. The Rising Star cave system is managed jointly by the University of the Witwatersrand and the South African Heritage Resources Agency. The Naledi chamber is accessible only to individuals meeting specific body size criteria who have completed technical caving training. No independent access is permitted. Active excavation is ongoing. The cave system remains incompletely mapped. How did Homo naledi bring its dead through a 7-inch passage in total darkness? If the chute's narrowest point restricts access to the smallest members of the group, then the smallest individuals were the ones managing the dead, which raises a further question about social structure and role differentiation that no evidence has yet resolved. What is in the unmapped sections of the Rising Star system beyond Naledi and Naledi? If deliberate mortuary behavior does not require a large brain, what other behaviors currently attributed to complex cognition also do not require it? And if a hominin was doing this 300,000 years ago, making decisions about where its dead should go, navigating a 39-foot vertical drop in darkness to take them there. What exactly are we measuring when we measure brain volume? And what have we been wrong about for how long? Rising Star gave us a new species and a question about what burial means. Vindija Cave, unremarkable from the outside, a limestone opening on a forested hillside in Croatia, gave us something we did not expect to find at all. It gave us ourselves. Number 10. Vindija Cave. The year is 2006. You're a paleogeneticist at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. On your bench are 3 bone fragments that arrived from Croatia. They were excavated by Mirko Malez of the Institute of Paleontology and Quaternary Geology in Zagreb, beginning in 1974, and have been in collections since. The fragments are catalogued as Vi 33, 16, Vi 33, 25, and Vi 33, 26. They came from a cave in the wooded hills of Varaždin County, approximately 37 miles north of Zagreb, a limestone opening on a forested hillside that from the outside is indistinguishable from hundreds of other karst caves in the Croatian highlands. The chamber where these fragments were found is smaller than a residential bathroom. The bones are between 38,000 and 44,000 years old. They belong to 3 separate Neanderthal individuals. You extract DNA from the cortical bone. You begin sequencing. The full results will take 4 more years to assemble. In 2010, Svante Pääbo's team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published the draft Neanderthal nuclear genome in Science, the first complete ancient hominin genome ever assembled. The primary source material was the 3 Vindija fragments. The paper established what no previous research had confirmed. All living humans of non-African ancestry carry between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA, not as metaphor, not as colloquial shorthand, as actual genomic sequence, specific identifiable regions, inherited from Neanderthals who interbred with Homo sapiens after modern humans migrated out of Africa. The percentage is consistent across European, Asian, and Native American populations worldwide. Neanderthals are not fully extinct. They persist in partial form in the genome of every non-African human alive today. Pääbo received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022 for this body of work. 3 bones from a room smaller than a residential bathroom rewrote the history of the human species. Here's where it gets strange. The lower stratigraphic levels of Vindija Cave have not been fully excavated. The cave has multiple distinct occupation layers. The upper levels, from which the Vi 33 fragments came, have been studied. The lower levels, which may contain material from earlier periods of Neanderthal occupation, remain incompletely worked. This is not a dramatic restriction. There is no sealed chamber, no institutional prohibition, no physical choke point measured in inches. The lower levels are simply unexcavated. Funding, research priority, and available personnel have not converged on completing the work. The cave is protected as a natural and cultural monument under Croatian law. Research excavation requires authorization from the Croatian Ministry of Culture and Media, and the pace of work has been determined by those practical constraints, not by a locked door. The Vi 33 fragments sat in a museum collection for 30 years before the technology existed to read them. Malez excavated them in the 1970s and catalogued them. They sat. Then Pääbo's team ran the sequence, and those 3 fragments contained the history of the human genome. The discovery happened not underground but at a laboratory bench in Leipzig, because that is where the technology was, and the bones were simply waiting. The lower levels are waiting in the same way. What methods will exist to apply to Vindija's remaining material in another 20 years is not yet imaginable. What those lower levels contain is not known. That is not a figure of speech. It is not known. Vindija Cave is accessible via a footpath in the Vindija Forest, Lepoglava municipality. It is protected as a natural and cultural monument under Croatian law. Research excavation requires authorization from the Croatian Ministry of Culture and Media. The lower stratigraphic levels remain incompletely excavated. The site does not receive public visitors. What is in the lower levels of Vindija that predates the Vi 33 fragments? If 3 bones from the upper levels rewrote human evolutionary history, what does a fully excavated Vindija look like? The 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA in every non-African human today represents interbreeding events that occurred across multiple sites. Vindigia is the source of the genomic sequence, not the only place the interbreeding happened. If Neanderthal DNA influences immune response, pain sensitivity, and metabolic function in ways researchers are still documenting, effects that the interbred lineage has been living with for 40,000 years without knowing, what else is encoded in that 1 to 4% that we have not yet read? And what does it mean that the most significant finding about what we are came from 3 fragments of someone else, in a cave that looks like nothing from the outside? Every site on this list has a known sealed section, a passage not entered, a chamber not excavated, a fragment not yet analyzed. In most cases, the obstacle is not political will. It is the site itself, too narrow, too unstable, too fragile, too deep, too wet, or simply not yet reached. The bones of Homo heidelbergensis are still in that shaft. The Cave of the Letters still has 2 fingers no one has entered. The Denisova East Chamber is still closed. The sanctuary at Tito Bustillo has been seen but not touched. From the pit of bones at Atapuerca to the chalk cliffs of Qumran, from the East Chamber at Denisova to the rope descent at Nahal Hever, from the highland caves of Armenia to the flooded passages at Ardales, from the sanctuary at Tito Bustillo to the breccia at Sterkfontein, from the chute at Rising Star to the forested hill at Vindigia, 10 caves, 10 sealed sections, 10 versions of the same pattern. We covered 10 ancient underground sites where sealed passages and unexcavated chambers hold evidence that has not yet been seen. Every one of them is still producing, and every one of them still has a door no team has finished opening. They are, as they have always been, still closed. Subscribe, leave a comment. Which one would you open first, and what do you think is stopping us?